So I call this presentation from trigger to truth, and we're going to find a very practical way through mindfulness and through specifically a mindfulness practice that I find again and again super useful in the lens and in the context of yoga philosophy. So I think it's going to be very interesting for everyone here. How do I pass this? Okay, like this. So I want you to recall a moment in the past, maybe 24 hours or maybe past week when you got triggered. And right now we're looking at a woman who's, frustrated and angry and like seems to have a headache. That's not necessarily how your trigger situation could have come up, but a moment where you felt like, this didn't feel right. And then it created a certain internal, like, feeling and felt sense and emotion and perhaps even thoughts that like you were like, I don't love this kind of thing. So I want you to think of that situation, and we're gonna work with it again towards the end. So I want you to keep it in mind and find one that it wasn't like that it didn't trigger if you do have some sort of trauma, that it didn't trigger like a PTSD, a post-traumatic like full on experience, but something that can range in mildness, or like how strong it was, but that you were like, yeah, this didn't feel right, and stick to that one. And, I want you to notice in that moment, how are you feeling about yourself? Not about the other person, if there was someone involved, nor about the external situation, but like, how are you feeling about yourself? There was, you know, perhaps if you can recall something around it. Just leaving it out there, we're going to investigate it a little bit further later. Now, this is something that I noticed after working so much with these practices. And it was that for me, when I would find a bigger trigger in my life, when something was like really triggering, I would notice that I was holding a stronger identification with something that I was not. So let me give you an example. Like if I was being triggered by an external situation that made me like, perhaps even out of proportion or even, proportionate to it, make me react. If I was to step and notice like what's happening, I can find that in a way I am getting contracted into an identity of something I am not, whether that is like my physical body or my social status or even, my gender or perhaps like what I want others to believe from me. And we'll explore this a little bit better, but just to give you the premise of like, what if we explore this together? When there's a bigger trigger, there's a stronger identification with something I am not. And we all know with yoga that we're more than just this body, we're more than just this mind, we're more than just our beliefs, we're more than our conditionings, we're more than, like our lineage patterns and all of these things. We're more than that. And that's probably why we came to the spiritual path in the beginning, to like figure out what are we beyond this it's so solid, right? So we're going to work with two concepts from the Inner Path deck. The first one is avidya, which can be seen and translated as like an ignorance, but ignorance not in the sense of like the absence of information or like not being smart, but the absence of, from the yogic concept of pure knowledge, of jnana or even vijnana, like special wisdom. Wisdom, I like it more than knowledge because it's like the understanding of reality without the veil. If you notice, there is this veil on this woman's eyes that is covering her ability to see things for what they are. So, it's like we're walking around with tainted sunglasses or glasses, and we only see reality through those lenses, believing that that's reality. So avidya are those lenses. Another way that I'm going to introduce avidya in this class is one which I find very helpful to understand, which is not just a veil, but also a sense of contraction. I am super influenced by non-dual Shaiva Tantra. And in non-dual Shaiva Tantra, because it's non-dual, there is not such thing as like so much as like real and unreal. It's just a matter of perception. And everything is part of that one field of consciousness that has, not by mistake, veiled himself, herself. So it's not by mistake or not by an error or not by an original sin that we are ignorant. It's just because God, Goddess, or, reality in its multifaceted play of consciousness just decided to contract into the individual form that we are one another. And without that contraction, we wouldn't be able to experience reality in the way that we do. We just would be, an ocean of oneness. But the whole game is to experience not that, so then appreciate that. You know what I mean? Then we have, so that's avidya. Then we have our samskaras, which are our impressions. They can be, dormant or active or latent or active. So like dormant, like a seed that is dormant is just like a seed that maybe you're storing in your cupboard, and like that seed, won't sprout in a little glass jar. But when you have the seed and you plant it in the right soil and under the right conditions, that can start sprouting. Like that's like it has the latency of being alive and manifested. And then we have the ones that are fully formed. So our samskaras are impressions that we have gathered through this and previous lifetimes that have created strong imprints in us. If we think of it in the modern psychological lens, it will be like our traumatic experiences, perhaps. They don't have to be supercharged as be classified as trauma, but they are this thing that help like make us stuck in certain patterns. So there might be something that you recognize, especially when you're in the container of like a yoga retreat. That's usually when you're like, oh, I'm noticing through what I'm getting triggered that there's a habitual pattern that I'm over and over and over again. And sometimes those patterns are there, but we're not even aware of them. For example, I am a mother. Before I was a mother, there were many patterns that for me didn't exist. And, as a mother, I was like, oh, okay, like this is alive, and it wouldn't have come alive. It wasn't because I have a little human to tend to and take care of, a very strong-willed little one. Samskara and avidya. Then, when we look again into the phrase that I showed you before, and maybe we go back for a moment, the bigger the trigger, the stronger the identification with something I am not. So what gets triggered? Are samskaras, the old pattern, these conditionings, these old impressions that shape our perception. What's behind it? Our contracted sense of self, or our illusory sense of perception, let's say, when we become identified with something who we are not, beyond our body, beyond our beliefs, beyond our things, right? So what we have here is an astronaut, right? What does the astronaut need to be able to go to the space? Maybe let's say this is Mars, it looks like Mars, and be able to function. It needs a suit, right? Let's look at the suit. It has like everything like you would need to be functioning, in this hostile environment that we are not necessarily made for. So this is what we built for ourselves in order to survive. These tendencies, these samskaras, these conditionings, if we go back, they tend to be very, primal from our infancy, most likely. And life is very intelligent. Life is super intelligent. So it creates this protective mechanism that helps us become functioning. So then we become grown-ups and we're wearing our suits and we're functioning. What happens is that when that, like unsuitable environment is changed, so the astronaut goes back to, let's say, the safety of planet Earth. if we don't remove our suits, what's going to happen? Imagine how uncomfortable it is. You have to pee and poop in that suit. And, the breathing and the moving around and like going shopping in the supermarket, like, it's just going to be uncomfortable. And we're going to be like hot and, uncomfortable, just like frustrated even. So, this is what happens with the patterns that we outgrow. They served us, they were there for a reason, they kept us safe and even functional. But then we come back to the safety of, like a different scenario, and this doesn't serve us anymore. So it's like, oh, okay, this suit, I got so identified with it. It became so much of like, of course, it helped me survive. So I could even like emotionally got attached to it. But now I need to let it go because it's no longer serving me. This identification, this contracted sense of self is now ready to move on. So perhaps this is something that we're going to look in how to release that suit. A third concept that is not in the inner path, but that I want us to look, which is also a yogic term, it's called vasana. And it's like the impulse. You have, we'll look at it and how it all fits together, but the impulse of reactivity, something happens, you get the trigger. What gets triggered underneath is this conditioning that's been with you for a long time. And how you respond or, react, it's like that vasana. It's like you have this fireball that you just want to throw. And you might be familiar with what's coming next, which is like our ways of responding, our ways of impulsively, perhaps, like just like coming to a threatening situation. So it's that bullet that comes out, like that, the reaction, right? Is you're being triggered. This is a trigger, and then the whole thing that happens inside. But what comes out is the vasana. And in the animal world, it is like super clear, right? We have, let me move myself here. We have this reaction with animals, which is fight. Then we have, with a threat, right? Then we have flight, the running away. We have freeze, which, it's like hiding or just like non-reacting, but not from the place of, from the inside, but just like the freezing. And then we have this one, which is fawning, which is basically just like, look how cute I am. I'm gonna please you because, fawning is mostly like people pleasing. But if you notice this, like I chose animal images here because it's part of our wiring. We are mammals, we are animals. So it's like part of the evolutionary that we didn't get to skip, even if we believe us in the top of the hierarchy of animals, like we can't override that, which is our instincts for survivals. Fighting, flighting, freezing, and or fawning. And these reactions, they were, let's say, installed in our system so that we would, protect ourselves from threats. But now in the modern days, it's not like we are hunting for our food and like a tiger can come hunt us. Our threats nowadays are psychological threats. They are the boss doesn't like me, therefore I'm going to fawn so that I don't get fired. Or, the freeze response, procrastination. I'm guilty of that on this one, where like I'm super overwhelmed. It's just like there's too much to do. Just gonna sit in the couch and scroll. That's also like, coming to dissociation. Or my little one, I've realized when she gets super triggered, my little one goes into full bite. Like she wants to bite me, scratch me. It's been super interesting to just like be like, whoa, this is intense. Fight is just like I'm gonna fight for my life right now because you said I can't have an ice cream for lunch. And then the flight, oh, maybe I'll just pack my bags and go and travel. That was also one of my usual responses. We each have our own ways to do it. And, perhaps some of this now you're like, oh, okay, I can relate. So we have this neuroscientist called Daniel Siegel, and he has the hand-brain model that I found it's very, very useful. I'm just going to stop sharing the screen just for the moment because I want you to see my hand. So he says, like, let's say this is the brain. This is the amygdala center. The amygdala center is the one in charge of the fight, flight, freeze, emotional reactivity, limbic brain. That you don't need to know this terms, but just like this is where you get activated when it's like fight for your life or flight or freeze. These things that we're looking at. This is the amygdala. Then this is the brainstem that communicates the information to the rest of the body. Right, the brain commands, and the rest of the nervous system responds. Then we have usually this, which is our prefrontal cortex, which is what distinct us from most, from animals. There's some animals that have a really developed prefrontal cortex, like the dolphins. But this is what like we have super developed as humans, which is what takes the longest to develop in children. Not takes the longest, but is one of the things that takes some time to develop in them. And this is how we get logical reasoning. We have more like time frames. We have more like a vision of like more of a future. We are connected to our instinct, but also to our wisdom, to our intuition, to the bigger picture. We're just, as Daniel Siegel puts it, we're online. When we like this is passing the information down to the brainstem and to the rest of the nervous system. The rest of the body is just like, we are good. When something threatening, and again, let's think of psychological threats more than biological threats. When something is threatening us, what happens is that we flip our lid. Now, the prefrontal cortex is no longer passing the information down to the rest of the body. What is doing that is the amygdala. Fight, flight, or freeze, or fawn. And this is what's communicating to the rest of the nervous system, like, we need to, like, get out of the situation in the best way that we can with our suits, right? And then we talk about like what biologically that means is just high cortisol. You're like ready to run, so you have high blood pressure, like all of these things, right? But basically, I'm gonna go back to sharing my screen. So basically, when we flip our lid, we are no longer online. What the resources of mindfulness, meditation, yoga nidra, asana, pranayama, all of this is helping us to like be able to, when we are like this, be able to choose consciously and like start to come back online so that the prefrontal cortex can choose and act and not our amygdala react. So this is a bit of a little like cycle here of what happens, just kind of like summarizing up what we've seen so far. There is a trigger, a threatening situation, and that activates some old wound conditioning, that maybe we weren't even aware of it, or maybe we were super aware of it, but it's just like gets activated. Then we get basically hijacked. It means that we are no longer in our true sense of capacities, and like of wisdom. We just get hijacked. What this does is that through our impulses it makes us react, most often through like an unconstructive reaction, such as fighting or whatever it is, or even the freezing, that also is like stored in our nervous system. So like we do something that it keeps us in our reality of safe, but really what it does is just like it's an unconstructive reaction that then reinforces our sense of being separate, like our this illusion of not being our true expansive sense of self. So then this happens again. It's like it's a vicious cycle that we repeat over and over. How do we get out of the cycle? Through awareness and compassion, truly. And how do we cultivate awareness and compassion? In different ways, like as I've mentioned, a few of the practices you've been doing, yoga nidra, all of these things is installing new ways of perception that can help us get unstuck when we get triggered, really. There's this quote from Viktor Frankl that says, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. The stimulus, right? The trigger, and the response, there is a space. Sometimes there's almost no space. And it feels like we have no choice. When we practice again and again, these practices that help us come back into an alignment of ourselves, a restoration of our nervous system, and as we expand also our awareness of like myself and what triggers me and what I'm carrying and like, like all these things, the space, and as we practice what I'm going to teach you today, the space starts to become a little bit bigger. It takes practice. It takes time. It takes repetition. But it is where our freedom lies. Because again, if the space is very narrow or non-existent, we're not free. We are absolutely bound to our conditionings and to, whatever we're carrying, and to our unreal sense of self and unreal sense of other, truly. But in order to gain more freedom for that, we widen the gap, and we widen the gap by pausing. So I want you to imagine that you're walking maybe through the bamboo forest or somewhere in Costa Rica, since you're in a very jungly area. And all of a sudden, like a dog comes and like starts like, "Arr!" You get triggered, scared, right? You're like, oh my God. But then you notice something. The dog can't move, but the dog is really angry. And like, if he could, he would for sure bite you. But then you notice that this dog has his little leg in a trap. And he can't move and he's hurt. There is something there that can make him, and he's really hurt. What happens in you? There is a moment of like, like even again, you can choose your own reaction. Do you fight the dog? You hit him with a stick? Do you fly and go far? Do you just freeze? Or do you give him a bone? You know what it is? But like when you see that something that this dog is just like as scared as you and is just reacting from this place of survival, perhaps something changes. You're like, oh, it's almost like it can bring you back online, right? So it's just interesting to notice, both for ourselves and for others, that we're often this dog. Or I'm going to dare to say we're always, depending if we're choosing to, latch in anger or not. But it's just like there's always something deeper beyond the reaction, which is like the ouch, this hurts. So how can we go and find that? So pausing, as I just said before, pausing is the first step to rewire the whole pattern, right? To what one of my teachers, Tara Brach, would say is like to do the U-turn. It's like you press the gas, you just go highway full speed, and then you're like, I'm going in the wrong direction. And then you make the U-turn. So it's like making that U-turn is again and again, repetition, consistency. We looked at the card of tapas or tapasya the first day. It's that discipline of like going against our, our tendencies, really. So pausing. Then we have this concept, which I've already woven into it, which is the neuroplasticity. And then there's this saying, super common in neuroscience, which is neurons that fire together, wire together. Biology is impeccable. Like it's absolutely impeccable. And our systems are always trying to optimize themselves. So like once you learn something, the typical example would be like driving. When you know where you need to go to work, you can get there without even noticing it. With like autopilot brings you there, right? Or another common one that I like to share is like sun salutations. Sun salutations, if you tend to do the same one, they can become so automated that very little of you is like of your, at least of your conscious awareness, can be involved in the process when you get there. When you're learning them, you're fully wired to like be present and stuff. But when it's part of second nature, and that's because again, like our systems are just trying to optimize in the best way it can. So neurons, right, the neuronal pathways, when there's like a certain activity that is just a constant. So let's say like a thought pattern or a thought process, or even like reinforced by belief and behavior, then the neurons are like, we're not gonna even bother in like keeping some distance between one another because we know this is like repeating itself. We're just gonna wire it together. And it's like a path in the jungle. You walk it once and like it's full of grass and weeds and whatnot and plants. But the more you walk it, the earth will just kind of like open to you, like it's just gonna be then there. That doesn't mean it's like now paved with concrete and undoable. This is what neuroplasticity is teaching us, which is what people before didn't believe. Like scientists a few decades or years back, like they didn't believe that you could change. You were like, oh, you're 21 and then that's it, you can't change how you think. But then they found that actually there is plasticity, mobility, malleability in how our neurons happen. So even though they wire together, when you stop repeating the same mechanism again, again, and again, again, they can wire differently. Like, that we have this possibility of redoing it differently. You stop walking that same path, nature will grow back, and you start walking another one, and nature will open up. So we're not doomed, you know, neither yoga tells us that, neither like now science. Like we're not doomed to like our ways, this is how I am and I'm stuck as I am, and you better like be fine with that or not be around me. No, we have this absolute potential to expand and grow and change and rewire. And just now to tie up with the concepts that we looked, samskaras, vasanas, and avidya. So samskara is like the knot, the contraction, the imprint, the conditioning that's been there for some time, that just, whether we know it or not. The vasana is the impulse, the reaction, that like I just need to do something. I can't stay still. And I used to teach, I haven't taught this in a while, but like, I don't know if any of you can think of ever being in an actually life-threatening situation. But I would remember like this was my moment of like, oh wow. I remember being at a place where like people got physically violent. My reaction was to run. It was, like I had friends in the space or whatever, but like my reaction was just like, I'm just gonna run 3-4 blocks down the road. And the moment I arrived to the fourth block, it was just like I would come conscious. I would become back online. The flight was an absolute reaction that like I wasn't consciously thinking about my friends, thinking, all of these things. It was just like an absolute vasana of survival that I had almost like no control with, right? So then you notice like, oh, okay, when we get also in the psychological threats, things like that tend to happen. So that's the impulse that, we train to control basically. And avidya, that the illusion, the contraction, the veil of separateness is who we think we are and why the cycles are perpetuated, right? The repatterning then happens. Our vasanas, these impulses, when we choose to make the U-turn again and again, is how we repattern our vasanas. So then we start choosing again the gap between stimulus and response. Then our samskaras, our conditionings, they are dissolved through both awareness and compassion. This loving presence that we're gonna, not look into with rain. And then our, the avidya, which is our condition. It's our condition of our contracted awareness, starts to soften, and we start to experience, like a loosening of that contraction through repetition of this of the loving presence, of taking the U-turn, and with the desire, with the aspiration to be to know the truth, to be more intimate with reality in the truthful way that it is. And truth, satya, which you haven't seen yet, but like satya is truthfulness, is more often uncomfortable, more often than not uncomfortable. And how can we choose that over the comfort of avidya, right? The comfort of our conditioning, of what we've known always, the suit. We got so used to it that we mistaken it for like as a comfortable thing, when in reality it's super uncomfortable, when we realize that it is uncomfortable. So this is the repatterning.